There's more involved than just water occurring on this occasion. To say there was seismic activity would be an understatement. That would have been earthquakes, volcanoes, lava being released onto the Earth's surface. All these things are happening at the same time to where the earth was overwhelmed by a tremendous amount of water. What is the evidence that the earth was once covered with water? And of course, here's another one of those matters where individuals have said that the flood was only a local flood. Well, that's a problem, since that's not what the text says. The text says the flood waters were over the whole earth. As a matter of fact, here in chapter 7, verse 17 through 20, the flood was 40 days upon the earth. The water increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. The interesting thing about water is that it takes the path of least resistance, and thus, if all the mountains are covered, then that means everything's covered. Everything's covered. 15 cubits above the highest mountain. Now, some people say, well, there's the tall mountains that exist in our world today, then there's just absolutely no way that water could be up there that high. So you've got a Polaroid that proving that to be the case? And exactly. The upheaval in the earth when the flood water started receding could have resulted in all types of changing in topography. Obviously, that's when the Grand Canyon was formed. That's obviously when the Sequatchie Valley was formed, and many other valleys in the world were formed. It was through the runoff of all this huge amount of water that was on the earth. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now here's something that I had never thought about till I was preparing for this particular lesson. But there's something about building a ship that you have to take into consideration, that the ship doesn't float right on top of the water. It will go down into the water, okay? And a ship this big, as the ark was, would itself go into the water about 15 cubits, okay? So if you build a ship, then you've got to figure out how much water is going to be displaced by the ship sinking down in it. So in order to not hit the top of the highest mountains, then actually the water had to be 30 cubits high, more so than 15 cubits high, if that's the case. Or else you'd be running into mountaintops at different points along the line. And there's the mathematical configuration as to determine how much that is. Now here's something about the dinosaurs real quick. Dinosaur graveyards are everywhere. Everywhere. Now, I reckon why that is. You know, one of the things that I observed in my young lifetime many, many years ago is that I never could find any skunk fossils or possum fossils or raccoon fossils. By the time they'd start to become a fossil, something would eat them right off the road, you know, and they never had the chance. Why is that? Why wouldn't there be more fossils? What causes fossils anyhow? They got to get covered up real quick. Well, reckon what could cover up a whole lot of things real quick? Well, I'd say it would be the flood. And that's why when you look at the facts of the case, fossils have been found in the Arctic. Fossils have been found in Antarctica. Fossils have been found on all 7 continents. In Tanzania, there are tons of fossils that have been found. Dinosaur National Park on the border of Colorado and Utah contains 300 intact fossils. Now, how you get that many piles of bones and skin all in one place? They had to be formed all at one time. They had to be in a drainage ditch and got covered up. You know, it was a few years ago, what took place when Mount St. Helens erupted and how that coal was formed. Tell that, Carrie. Carrie's watched this on National Geographic, and tell us what you know about that. And what we told, well, in order to have coal, you've got to have eons and eons and eons of time. Well, 40 years is not an eon of time, I don't think. So just the evidence that's aplenty there that we have a logical, reasonable explanation for, that has to be completely evaporated from even the thinking of these people who demand. And the thing about atheism and evolution is, the idea is, if you have enough time, the impossible can happen. That's what they believe. If you just get enough time, then something can come from nothing. Add a couple of million years, and then the impossible will happen. That's not reasonable. That's not rational. Exactly. That's not the way science works. And so science, the word science simply means knowledge. And when you're talking about speculation, then that's not knowledge. That's speculation. Let's call it by its right name.
Is there any correlation between the flood and the ice age?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, there's a very likely, because you find so much evidence of grass-eating creatures on the poles, even, that at one time the earth being watered with something like a canopy and sort of like a greenhouse effect, then there was no ice. Everything was more like a forest. But then after the flood, then everything changed dramatically. And the beginning then of the polar caps and the cold weather and all would have been a certain change in the environment that would have led to so many different things that people simply want to ascribe to eons and eons and eons of time. You know, they'll talk about the most recent ice age as if in the last 10,000 years there's been multiple ice ages when there hasn't. That's all just pure speculation from a rejection of what the Bible actually says.
If you block out the sun with the seismic activity, the volcanoes, and then the rain itself, and all the turbulence that's going on in the earth, it's probably going to cause, debris as well as moisture in the air.
Yes.
Which blocks out a lot of the sun, which that probably happened for a long period of time.
Yes. Exactly.
But the other thing is continental drift.
Yes.
When you look at North and South America, and you put it up against Africa and Europe, you know.
They used to be connected.
It fit.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, this may be just totally make no sense, which is understandable. It's okay, it won't hurt my feelings. I don't understand that, okay, you don't hear in the Bible or in even old writings like Josephus and all back in that time about trillions and millions of years and billions. When did those words come into effect? And then they came into effect by man. Man, you don't hear of billions of years back years ago. When did those words start becoming a part of history?
I think it had to be with the so-called Enlightenment.
And see, so that's where man is the one that made all this stuff
Sure.
up. It's not
I mean, you just think, I mean, one of the earliest science experiments I remember being taught was they used to think that if you had some dirty rags over in the corner, then spontaneously rats would develop. Well, I mean, people believe that forever. In other words, spontaneous generation. But Louis Pasteur was the one that proved that's not the case at all. If you have a pure and a clean environment, there ain't nothing going to be produced. Now, you get a fly in there, and you're going to end up with maggots sooner or later, but you've got to contaminate it. If you don't have anything, then you never will have anything. It's our position, because it's the biblical position, that God is the only thing that has always existed. Matter didn't always exist. God has always existed. He's the eternal one. And He created what we have in the universe today, with the priority still being on the spiritual, but this world was created for our benefit for a small amount of time.
That's what Brian said, that apologetics present is real short, easy to understand article. It kind of connects, shows you the connections with the flood
And the Ice Age. And then, of course, one of the primary objectives that you'd look to the flood to as well, and what the message of the flood is does God mean what He says, and does He keep His promises when He gives them? You know, when He looked upon the situation that man was in there in Genesis chapter 6, his mind was always on ungodly stuff, then He says, I'm going to destroy man. And of course, He told Noah, who was a just man, not a perfect man, but a faithful man, plugged into the right system, wanting to do God's bidding, then He told him to build an ark, and he and his family escaped the destruction that came about by the flood. You know, so just as surely as God promised He was going to destroy the world with a flood, He did. But then He also made the future reference that He was not going to destroy the world with a flood ever again. But just like on the Jill Miller film strips, the next time the world will be destroyed with what? With fire. Okay? And that's the message of the Bible. And so here, this is the carrying out of that covenant, that He will not destroy the world with a flood ever again. And that's every time you see a rainbow, then hopefully you remember that. Hopefully you don't start thinking you got a pull for women marrying women and men marrying men. I don't have anything to do with the rainbow. But you start thinking about the promise that God made and how that He's true to that promise for sure. Any other questions on or comments on this particular material? All right. So at least we can tell Joel that I did get started in the book of Ecclesiastes. It wasn't that long ago that we actually studied the book of Ecclesiastes, and I say it wasn't that long ago. It could have been 15 years. Good old as me, 15 years is just a bucket, dropping the bucket, a couple of weeks ago. But who is the book of Ecclesiastes distributed to? Solomon. And of course, there's a number of reasons why, primarily, why you don't see the name Solomon attached. You do find the designation, the son of David, who was a king in Israel, and you say, Solomon, had to be Solomon. Of course, Solomon was. And one of the last things that I did on Solomon before I retired, was went through and noted how that here was a man who had all the money in all the world available to him. I mean, he made Elon Musk, he made him look like a pauper. I mean, Solomon was rich. He was so rich that he brought in, just by taxes on foreign nations, he brought in 200 tons of gold a year. That's a bunch. He'd say, let me move this other gold over here in my safe here, and you bring that gold in here. There was nothing that was outside of his ability to buy. He could buy anything. Richest man on earth. And yet he is miserable. That don't make no sense. The point, of course, is that if you could be happy with a bunch of stuff, then this is a fella that you'd want to look to because he had everything that you can imagine. But he didn't. He was not satisfied. Matter of fact, he described what he was trying to accomplish in finding satisfaction in physical stuff. He said it was like grasping after the wind. Not very fulfilling whatsoever. You know. But not only was Solomon the richest man in the world, he was the smartest man in the world. He was the wisest man. Other than the Lord, he was the smartest man that ever lived. So somebody says, man, if I was that rich and if I was that smart, then buddy, he is that smart and that rich. He didn't have money. He said it was just foolish existence here on this earth. It was like grasping after the wind again. Everything under the sun just brought him despair. He looked at everything that happened and it didn't make any sense. One of the examples he used is here's a fellow who's worked his whole life and saved up money and got this great estate, and then he ends up dying and he's got a foolish son that ends up wasting everything. He says, that ain't right. Well, we agree, that ain't right. But you can't stop a foolish son from being a foolish son if he wants to be a foolish son. But not only was he the richest, not only was he the wisest, he's the most powerful man in all the world. He's so powerful that people came just to see the things that he had the ability to do. So if you got power and wealth and wisdom, and you've got it to the nth degree, then surely you can be satisfied. Well, he won. He won. He thought happiness would come with women. 1,000 women. What an idiot. I don't care how smart he is, he's an idiot. 1,000 women. All these business ventures he engaged in. He had the finest gardens, the finest orchards, the finest, you name it, he had the best. Had the finest house to live in you could ever imagine. And it was all like grasping after the wind. So here's the point, of course, that we'll see at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. If Solomon could not find fulfilling happiness and a blessed state, then who in the world do we think we are if we think those things are going to give it to us? It ain't going to happen. It's not to be found there. And that's why he said at the end of this book, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man, or this is man's all. It's not in writing all these books. It's not in writing all these songs. It's not in having all these women. It's not in all these business ventures. It's not there. It's in recognizing God for who God is and reverencing and respecting him and doing his bidding. Somebody says, well, that's just too simple. Well, that's the way God designed it.
I don't know how old Solomon was when he became king off the top of my head. I know that it says he reigned for 40 years. And right after he became king, that's when he asked for all that wisdom. He was younger, of course. And like you said, he had more wisdom than anybody, but he still made a lot of foolish mistakes because he married strange women and everything. But even that just goes to show you too, even though he was the wisest man, when you've lived a lot of life, a lot of times we should have wisdom.
Sure.
We can look back and be wise about maybe how we give advice and stuff just because we have lived a little bit of life.
Yeah. And that was, and you know, so many of the Proverbs were written by Solomon too, and he's trying to warn his son, and of course young men in general, don't be as dumb as I was in regards to the female. You know, don't do it. You know, some of the classic instruction, if you see a woman dressed in the attire of a harlot, she probably is, don't go near her. Why would some old man tell some young man that? Maybe he's been took to the cleaners by that woman. He don't want his son to do the same foolish thing he did, you know. And so, and the thing is, when God granted, not only, you know, you got Solomon, he gave him all this wisdom and all this money too, not because he asked for the money, but because it was a kicker. It did not take away his free moral agency, obviously. And so when he loved many strange women, and that don't mean they were women that had 3 eyeballs and 2 heads, or you know, it means they were unauthorized to be married to women. That's who they were. And they turned his heart away from God. And so he accommodated their religious practices and built altars so they could worship their heathen deities without having to leave Jerusalem, of all things. That's not very smart, even though he was a wise man, for sure.
Why did the evolutionary cycle supposedly not create a meaning to life?
Exactly.
Provided the physical, what about, you know, what are you gonna, the age, 75 years here on this earth, you die and that's it?
Yeah,
Come on.
yeah. Exactly, exactly.
Look at the wisdom that we have in the books we did write, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, they're wonderful.
Oh, absolutely.
We just listen to it.
Yeah, if we just take
That's the
advantage.
whole thing about making mistakes. It does give you a perspective that somebody that's never made a mistake,
Yeah, yeah,
you know, it's a little different, you know.
yeah. Yeah, experience is a hard taskmaster sometimes. I'm going to take it till class is over. Thank you, Malachi.